thank you everyone for joining us for this last session of the day. Today we'll be covering a topic that pretty much covers every business and human rights or responsible business issue that is out there. It is really trying also to connect many of the things that we have discussed during the forum so far, as well as some of the discussions and the deliberations which we'll be having over the next couple of days tomorrow. So thank you everyone for joining the session entitled Citizens and Consumers, the Missing Link. And I will explain what exactly we mean with this missing link in a bit. But before we do so, I would like to introduce you to our panel. I'm very honored to count the following three people among this panel. First of all, on my left, we have Sumi Dhanarajan. She is the Associate Director, Asia Pacific for Forum for the Future. Forum for the Future is a think tank working in partnership with business, governments, and civil society to accelerate the shift towards a sustainable future. Also on my left, we have Stefania Perna, and she is a project manager for the Thomson Reuters Foundation. The Thomson Reuters Foundation is the corporate foundation of Thomson Reuters, which is the global news and information services company, which we all know. TRF works to advance media freedom, foster more inclusive economies, and promote human rights. And finally, and certainly last but not least, on my right, we have Shubho Roy. He is the founder and chair of BIAS, which stands for Behavioral Insights, Architecture and Strategy. And it is a behavioral science consultancy firm. It is a collaboration between academia, the private sector, and policymakers. And they pioneer behavior change by rewiring human biases which impact decision-making. So we have a very diverse panel here today. And I would briefly like to elaborate the purpose of this session. So most of us by now in this room are familiar with the UNGPs, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. The UNGPs outline the duty of states to protect human rights and the responsibility of businesses, the duty of states to protect human rights and the responsibility of businesses to respect human rights. Now, a lot of efforts on business and human rights, BHR, have focused on top-down approaches. That is, policy and legislative initiatives by states and human rights due diligence by companies, often still multinational corporations. Now, the architect of the UNGPs, the late John Ruggie, argued that the failure of businesses to meet their responsibility to respect human rights can subject them to the courts of public opinion. And yesterday, the Swedish ambassador said that there is still a contrast between progress at the top and realities on the ground. And he asked us to move from promises towards meaningful action. Now, throughout the forum, we have also heard strong voices from civil society who are calling upon states and businesses to take meaningful action on business and human rights. Now, the major question of this session in front of us today is as follows. We all know pretty much what states and businesses should be doing. However, what role do citizens and consumers play in pushing states and businesses when they conceive their actions as insufficient? Without further ado, let us get into the questions. So first of all, I would like to turn to Sumi. Sumi, throughout your engagements with UNDP, between UNDP and the Forum of the Future, we have really benefited from your thought leadership. And I was wondering whether you could set the scene for our discussion today. So what I would like to ask you, what is the relationship between business and human rights or responsible business on the one hand and social movements on the other? So the relationship between business, human rights and social movements. And what is the role of consumers and citizens in promoting greater business respect for human rights? Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Kevin. Flattery will get you nowhere. Thank you for having me here, and thank you for actually ending today with this. It's a meta question, but it's certainly a very, very important one, and for me, a foundational one as we consider the future of the business and human rights movement, if indeed you can call us a movement. And I think that is I ask that as a question rather than making that a statement. So it's maybe something that you'd want to hold in your minds as we go forward with today's discussion. Are we a movement, and what makes us one? And if we are not, should we be aspiring to be one? And what would it mean to be one? But having made my point of view there, let me do the job and answer Kevin's question by first starting with perhaps, and this is maybe the wannabe academic at heart. Let's just frame up, what is a social movement, or how do we define a social movement? And then look at what its role has been in my opinion, being the genesis of the business and human rights field. So, social movements tend to emerge when there is some sort of grievance or dissatisfaction or concern or anger even about something that is happening which seems unfair, inequitable, dangerous to us as a society, and where the movement sees there's a need to redress it or to ensure that there's some kind of resistance towards what's going on. So that's the first thing. Comes out of something, the need to act. Secondly, social movements tend to be collective enterprises, and that's important. They're collective enterprises. There is no such thing as a movement of one, and there usually it has to be a movement of many thousands. And I think at some point, Kevin, you want to discuss the point around what creates that tipping point for change, and collective action is one of them. So secondly, it's collective. Thirdly, it's where the individuals and the organizations that are part of that movement feel bound by a shared worldview, a common purpose, a belief on what society should be. And that's what's bringing them together. You might want to refer to that almost like a shared ideology, if you like. And that tends to underpin any social movement that's emerging, particularly shared ideology. And then fourthly, and this is important in the context of what we're seeing in terms of new social movements that are coming about in the digital era, social movements engage in sustained, continuous action to bring about that change. They're not kind of quick, happen over a matter of days and then it goes away. Sometimes it may seem that in the moments where they erupt, but they're usually predicated on a long history of that movement. Just think about modern slavery. All right, and I probably need to go a bit faster on this. Social movements tend to provide the organizational and governance structure for activists to be able to formulate plans and coordinate action. Social movements frame the concerns and frame the solutions. They shape how we interpret the problems and the solutions. And this is important. We see what needs to be done because social movements create a kind of a frame for how we see action needs to be taken, and importantly, why action needs to be taken. So to come to your question, in relation to the business and human rights field, social movements have been critical to defining the relationship between business and human rights and saying why we should care when business operates with extractive, exploitative models. What has it done to us, not as individuals, but what is it doing to us as a society to have these kinds of models exist in our economy? And when this goes unchallenged, what are the implications of that? Social movements have been important, therefore, in enabling the business and human rights field to grow because they have shaped the organizational field within which business operate. And they influence the views of business stakeholders, whether they are the public, the consumers, prospective employees, business partners, regulators, or governance. Kevin, I'll give some examples of three movements which I think have been critical, and there are others, but for me, critical to shaping the business and human rights field. the contemporary business and human rights field, I should say, because in a conversation that we had earlier, we noted that this field has been around for a long, long time. So the contemporary form, so for me, contemporary, you can tell by the gray hairs, probably like 90s, right? 90s, late 90s is contemporary for me. So 3 movements. One, the anti-sweatshop movement, I think in the late 90s, was critical because it put out the idea that we should challenge business models of global supply chains. It raised concerns about this very new model at the time, that if you're Nike or Gap, you can produce your goods in another part of the world with no implications. There are implications. People get exploited. So that was the first. The second, and maybe this is a bias here, it's an issue close to my heart, was the movement around access to medicines. So in the late 90s, those of you who were already working in this field by then, you know, this was the height of the HIV/AIDS crisis. You know, we were seeing 4 million people a day in sub-Saharan Africa getting infected. And the pharmaceutical companies at the time were seen as, you know, they were providing a public good. We make medicines, that's a public good. But what that movement did was to say, that's not enough. You have a core responsibility not just to make medicines, but to make sure that they're accessible and they're affordable. And that was not what we were seeing at that point in time. So it shifted the idea. It's not enough just to make the goods. And this is relevant to the renewable energy sector now, right? Not enough that renewable energy is a public good. It is, and we need to accelerate it. But we should do it in a way that's ecologically safe and socially just. And the third movement is the extractive, the one that took action against the extractive industry. You know, Shell in Nigeria being a critical one back in the 90s, because that raised for us, I think, a fundamental tenet of the business and human rights field today, which is around free, prior, and informed consent being very important. So let me end by saying that in many ways, social movements have unlocked the business and human rights field's transformative potential, because movements drive us to see the need and to act for change. But the question that I'll end with in my intervention now is that as the business and human rights field has evolved, has it marginalized the role and the agency of social movements? You know, have we made the field one that's predominantly helmed by technocratic experts, possibly people like myself, and policymakers, and taken out the oxygen or the role of social movements as being the driver and the foundation of this field, and to what effect?
Thank you very much, Sumi. So yeah, a lot of interesting reflections there. I mean, so on your elements of the social movement, so one of the elements, it comes from dissatisfaction or anger. I think in all of our work, many of us work on business and human rights or responsible business or climate change. We do observe dissatisfaction or anger. The question also comes down, I guess, can we bring together these collectives, Sumi, and on shared worldviews? I mean, we have had some discussions, and we will be having discussions tomorrow on globalization, for example. Like, what are these shared worldviews? Can we achieve shared worldviews? So we'll be hearing more about that tomorrow. And sustained continued action. So how can we achieve that? And as you were asking, are some of the policymakers here in the room, people working for companies, for states, for the UN, perhaps for civil society organizations, are we operating in a silo, and how do we break those silos? So thank you very much, Sumi, for setting that scene. I think that really sets us up for the rest of the session. So Stefania, I would now like to turn to you. So yeah, you work at TRF, again, which is the foundation of the Thomson Reuters Foundation, the Thomson Reuters, so a media company, and you engage with media and journalists on a daily basis. As Sumi has said, throughout history, the media has played really an indispensable role in bringing business-related human rights abuses into the public domain. You mentioned many examples. We can also think, for example, of the Bhopal incident in the 1984, or even in the 17 and 1800s, when Europe was colonizing the world, and when even though there was not such a strong media as there is today, when consumers in Europe became aware of these issues, they did start to boycott some tea, for example. So that is some of the history. Now, Stefania, I want to ask you, again, kind of to set the scene for us, what is the role of the media in promoting greater business respect for people on the planet? Yeah, and how does that link to citizens and consumers? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kevin, and let me thank you also for inviting us to this panel. It's a pleasure being here, and it's a pleasure sharing the panel with such renowned friends and speakers. So my name is Stefania, and I'm a project manager, as Kevin has said, at the Thomson Reuters Foundation. So Kevin has before just mentioned and touched upon the three main work areas on which we focus, but let me repeat them. So the Thomson Reuters Foundation works to foster inclusive economies, to promote human rights through our pro bono legal support, but also, of course, we focus a lot on media freedom. So media freedom, of course, it's a big focus, as I just said, and it's why we focus on that, because we want societies to be free and open. And how do we have that? Well, when there is a healthy media system, and when information is inspired by specific principles, principles that are according to which the information is reliable, is independent, there is integrity, and information is free from bias. So when you ask me what is the role of the media has played an important role, as you just said, and this is the role which is informing, right? So, and informing is what media should do, and there is no doubt about it. It's more a question, how can we ensure that the information is received by the public and is perceived according to the principle to which information should aspire to? So unbiased, reliable, independent, and founded on integrity. So this is what we aim, right? So information should really be inspired by this principle, but if we look at reality, we see a reality which is quite different, definitely complex and multifaceted. So if we look at media organization, we have some media that actually report and provide an information that aspires and is independent, reliable, unbiased, and based on integrity. However, we can also see that in many cases, information is not just relied focus on news. It also adds on. It's complemented by opinion pieces. And opinion pieces sometimes are used and captured. And this is where we have disinformation. So this is a global trend, and it's not just focused on Thailand, it's not just focused on any specific countries. But if we want to look at what the Thai media ecosystem, if we want, looks like, we can see, and a report that has been published just recently by the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. What has revealed is the way in which Thai information is perceived is often characterized by sensationalism. What it means that information or issues are reported only where something that cannot be ignored is there. And also, it kind of is perceived with a negative tone. Before entering and start working in Thailand, so we're currently developing, implementing a project here in Thailand and in other countries which focuses on strengthening the capacities of journalists, independent, and in newsrooms on how they can report specifically on issues related to modern slavery, to forced labor, and human trafficking. So the way in which, before entering and before really shaping and contextualize our training, we've also looked at the Thai media ecosystem and how it is perceived when we look at modern slavery and human trafficking. And those two like global trends that I've just mentioned before have been depicted also at the national level. The way in which the public perceives foreigners, migrant workers. So we've heard about aliens, like migrant workers being depicted as aliens. And and this comes also through the news and the effect that is has had on the public is a sort of disattachment, mistrust, and a relationship which is not for the audience to rely, as it used to be, on the media to provide reliable information. So there is a problem there. There is a problem that needs to be addressed. And this is where we enter and this is how we focus our work with journalists in Thailand. So, and in other countries actually. And in order to improve that reporting that I said before, and going back to your question, so how can the media play a role that actually provides a call to action for the public to actually request from the bottom up accountability for actors to actually implement responsible business practice? Well, we think that by including into our trainings and the way in which we relate to journalists one specific journalism technique, which is called solution journalism, we are able to shift the focus from a news, which is often reported as a sensational and possibly with a negative tone, depicting it in a constructive way. I mean, Sumi, you also mentioned before, and it's kind of a buzzword, solution. We need to look for solutions. And solution journalism is a technique that does exactly this. And why is it so powerful? Because it's still founded on rigorous reporting. And it's a kind of a two-tiers approach, right? So we still investigate and find the issue, but in order to report on the issue, we look at what actors that are working to address these issues, what is that they are doing. And so by reporting from a solution perspective, so by reporting on what civil society are doing, what are the solutions and the initiatives that they have available, we're able to identify not just a path towards what is left to be done. So by learning on the successes and the failures of what main actors are doing, we are able to identify what is the missing link, who else do we need to bring into the picture, and how can we identifying a call to action for social movement and the general public to actually request those changes that are needed from a bottom-up perspective. This is very much one of the techniques. I'm not saying that this is a fit-for-all solution. I'm saying that what we've witnessed by using this technique is a different engagement, and it's a solution that complements investigative journalism and what has so far contributed to bring important issues to the attention of the public. So to sum up, media really need to keep on informing. There is a level and a quality of information that needs to be respected, and there are not magic spells, but definitely guidelines. And what we witnessed is solution journalism, so presenting an issue from a solution perspective can really create a constructive approach and bring together, again, the audience and the media. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stefania. I would like to come back to you later about how this relates to other stakeholders, if that's okay, and we turn to Shubho now. So Shubho, completely different topic, what we'll be talking about now, but certainly related. So just as a bit of background for everyone, Shubho and his firm and UNDP have been working to map the knowledge, attitudes, and practices of Asian youth on responsible consumption. That is, a consumption where youth buy products that are made with respect for human rights and without environmental impacts, or least environmental impacts as possible. Now, Shubho, we've been looking at whether young people think these kind of purchasing practices are important, and whether those attitudes translate into people using their money to purchase such products. We've heard a lot about the roles, the potential roles of citizens. Still, based on the findings of your research, why do we still have a gap among youth and consumers, despite various awareness raising and advocacy initiatives? And what is the perspective of behavioral science on this?
Thank you. I think this was the first time that I heard the word that citizen and consumers are two different animals. To be honest, in our behavioral science perspective, the consumer is a citizen, and every citizen tends to be a consumer. However, they tend to behave very differently, as I'll show you in a minute's time. All of you need to answer one simple question. Do you think that you are a smart buyer. That's it. Raise your hand if you think you're a smart buyer. Do you think you are a responsible citizen? Now, how many of you would like to raise both hands at the same time? That when you are trying to buy, and the last time you visited the shopping mall, or you were searching something online, you were actually putting on the hat of a responsible citizen and trying to assess and do a due diligence on the ethical practices in terms of the environmental practices or the labor practices. Raise your hands if you can do both. You cannot. The reason you can't do is it's almost like asking somebody to ride a cycle and read a book at the same time. The answer lies in different mental models. When you put on the hat of a consumer, you're trained to do three things: look, select, buy. But it's much more complicated than that. You're invariably going to, your parameters of consideration would be the price, good deal, bad deal, is there a bargain, is there a special offer, whether the garment or the accessory or electronics, what we're buying, will suit you or not, and how will others look at it, social signaling. And the third part of it is how will you justify it after you have purchased it? Nowhere in the scheme of things would you ever consider ethical practices or responsibility. It doesn't come naturally. However, the same you, when you will see a topic or a discussion on a social media, as Stephanie was talking about, or a social movement, you will genuinely, and I'm raising this point and I'm being honest about it, you'll genuinely care for it and will raise your voice. The question or the research that we embarked was that for the youth, and imagine we are all educated, more aware about UNGPs and other products, that's why we're here. An average college-going kid, how do you expect them to merge these two roles? So some of the biases that we saw were interesting. First and foremost, when asked what are the information areas or parameters that you consider, and they chose the parameters like any one of you would do: price, discount, schemes available, after-sale service, before-sale service, the quality of good, the new things, the novelty of the design, and all stuff. Nowhere did they pick up environmental practices. That's not the information they're seeking. And before, I also know the moment I ask you that what would be the remedy, all of you will jump and say more information and create awareness. And I'll talk about that because that's the second bias that we saw. There's a flip side to it. Information, there's plenty of it in this world. There's an information overload today. It is about which information would the brain of the youth pick up and which information is engaging for them. So when people ask me that as a behavioral science, what kind of information works with youth? And I simply say that if it's retweetable and Instagrammable, it's going to work. Anything which makes me get into a cognitive overload in terms of that it makes me think, and nobody takes out a spreadsheet, sorry. It's only for conferences like this where we'll deliberate on a point. In reality, things happen like this. You like something, you purchase. You'll think about the model of the car, you'll think about the EMI, you'll think about the loan, you don't think about labor practices. Nobody does that, at least the youth. So that's the second bias. The third one was even more interesting. When you ask them, what is sustainability and do they actually care about it? They'll say yes. But many of you might be skeptical about it and say that, okay, they are just doing lip services because they don't believe in it. The answer is they too. We did what is called an implicit bias tests. It's a psychology-based test where they can't fool the machine, though there are words which come up and they have to quickly decide. And the results were very optimistic. 90% and more youth feel genuinely for sustainability. Now, this is a classic issue. There's an intent, but it does not result into action. And this intent-action gap is something that we are studying on. Nice. Moving to the last point that I want to make on the information. We have to be very careful about what kind of information. Because one of the mental associations and the biases that we saw, because that's what we study, was that when you ask them about sustainability, there's a very strong mental association with environment. Kudos. But the point is, it overshadows associations with labor. So when you ask an average youngster, what does responsible consumption mean and how do you connect it with sustainability, their answer would be, yes, it means reuse, reduce, and recycle. It means that I switch off the air conditioning and I save water. It does not get into consumerism, and it has very weak associations with labor exploitations and even weaker associations with CSR activities of a company. And when you probe further, and our research says that it's interesting why it doesn't happen, because somewhere there's not a logical linkages with how the labor practices at the back end impact my life, how a brand investing in initiatives in a remote village impact my brand, whereas there's still, the media has played a very strong role in having a logical mental model of how environment relates to me. So in environment, I can still easily connect and relate to that. So those are the biases and those are the key findings from it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shubho. I see you've touched the audience. Okay, so I want to follow up on this. So if you had to wear a producer's hat, so you talked about social issues, how products are produced, what are the working conditions of people, for example. So if you had to wear the producer's hat, the person developing the product, what do you think are his motivations to respect human rights and beyond complying with legal requirements? And it means, like, is there a business case for respecting human rights?
There is, and it's a double-edged sword. And before that, I have to tell this, and this is very interesting, and probably will relate to this. When people try to understand why people don't wake up 6 a.m. in the morning and go to a gym, behavioral scientists say why they don't go to bed at 10 a.m. in the night. And before you ask me this question, is there a business case? Let's define businesses. Businesses are made of leaders. Leaders are human beings. The answer, at least to an extent, lies in the motives of an individual. At least in India, the average CEO's tenure is 3.5 years. And if your tenure is 3.5 years and the organization is focused on short-term goal achievements, then, of course, profit maximization is your business case. But the moment you extend this time horizon and you look at companies and said, okay, what about 20 years? Then it makes a perfect business case, because by that time, the social impact or the reputational potential damages have a monetary value that can be assigned to it. Businesses are trained to think of monies because they're, at the end of the day, as I always say, they're in the business of business. So the moment you extend this timeline, then of course, because there are 3 dimensions to it. 1, reputational damages are instant. B, reputational damages lead to monetary losses. 3, a brand is more than the intrinsic or the extrinsic value of the product or services. Brand is the halo effect. So if tomorrow a certain footballer keeps aside a certain drink, there is a butterfly impact in the stock markets in New York and Wall Street. And in the long run, I think the moment you extend the horizon, you will see this myopia diminishing. So there is a business case, according to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shubho. Okay, so I guess this is also where opinions get polarizing. We've also heard from other speakers at the forum who also sometimes said, like you said as well, actually, like sometimes there's a business case. You say in the long term there's always a business case. Well, actually, I want to ask this question to you, Sumi. I don't know if you want to respond to this. What do you think? Is there a business case? And I might ask Stefania as well if she wants to comment.
Kevin is being mischievous. He wants me to say there isn't. And I will comply by saying if there was one thing that I would do differently in my career over the last, oh gosh, I won't give away how many years in this field, it would have been back in the 90s not to make the business case. That would be the one thing I wish I'd done differently, was to not say there is a business case for complying with human rights. Because what it then set up was a whole path dependency of always having to say, you know, if you comply with human rights, you will ensure that your reputation's intact. You will be able to, employ people that you want, that you want to employ, and will want to come and work for you. That you'll make sure that you're going to continue. The business case has in my opinion, set us on the wrong path, because ultimately this has to be values-based, and I think we're seeing it now, right? You know, one of the things that we are working to do is to move from a compliance-led approach to business and human rights to a purpose-led approach by business to meet human rights standards. And I think in that move to being purpose-led, it has to be anchored in values. I just think as long as we are in the current economic model of growth with short-termism, Shubho, you pointed it out in what you just said, right? As long as we are in this model, then you know, there is a business case for extraction and exploitation. There's not really a business case for being socially just and regenerative in your approaches. And so, and you know, I guess that's my view on things. And I think one of the things that's perpetuating the current model of profit maximization is actually a lot of the work that we're doing in ESG compliance. I think it actually perpetuates that model rather than actually shifting us onto another path.
Would you like to respond?
Yes, let me just switch it on. So may I agree with you. I think my personal take on this, and it could be wrong, is that in the long term, no matter how hardcore a capitalist company you are, your chances of survival is only dependent if your business is purpose-led. So in my own personal, and you can unquote me later on, okay, is that all private sector companies and all companies will move towards social enterprise. But that's where what you're talking about, purpose, meets enterprise. Because you need the profits, whether your business model is for profit, not profit, applying back a certain profit based on grants, based on funds, there are different business models of it. But what we are saying, and because we work lots with startups and others who are into the social enterprise, profit, I think, has been victimized and also made a villain out a lot in the short term. Profits are good, and profits are required, provided they're used for the right purpose. And the means of getting that profit is ethical and sustainable. And I think that's on that part, so may I agree with you, that in the larger schema, in the longer run, there are no other ways that a business can survive. Because at the basic core level of any conglomerate is that it is responsible for at least its employees. And it is a creation of job that they're into. So no way you can say that this business is not into social enterprises. All businesses are, and all businesses will be a social enterprise in the future. There are no other ways. Thanks.
Okay, so I also think you're not that far apart. I mean, also what you're saying, as long as we have short-termism, there is not a business case to respect human rights, right? Because there might be personal interest for, say, a director to act in a certain way. But then on the long term, different story. And actually, I think you said something on the same line, right? In the long term, there might be a business case, or am I twisting your words?
I think what I'm saying is that we shouldn't have we shouldn't have had the paradigm of the business case as our foundation for the business and human rights movement. Had we started it with the paradigm being that there is a need for businesses as part of society to respect human rights, because otherwise you should not be part of a society, that would have been the right foundation to begin on. We began on the wrong foundations, okay, and now we're paying the price for it.
Thank you. Stefania, do you want to comment?
Yeah, thank you. And it's fascinating. It's great to be part of this conversation because as part of the work that we do, we also engage with businesses and private sector actors in the different countries where we operate, Thailand, India, Malaysia, and Colombia, right? So I would actually agree with both of you because if the system was different, we would have not needed a business case, right? But on the other hand, the business case is there. And just the other day, we had a small multi-stakeholder conference in which we hosted one business from Thailand who is actually implementing responsible business practices because they believe in it. Because they want to advance on it, and because they truly and genuinely believe that this is the way forward. However, we cannot be naive. Probably this is still 10%. Let's hope it will get 40, 50, and then 100% in the long run. But on the other hand, there are many other businesses that are not yet on that path and look at profit as the main objective. However, at the same time, is having a business case and is building a business case necessarily negative? What we are seeing in our engagement and also to influence our stakeholders to actually act upon responsible business practice is to present a business case that shows that if in the medium and short term, business don't actually take important action towards responsible business practice, and we have seen that because of the international regulation that are cascading down, human rights due diligence is one of them, it's actually important and urgent to do something and to act. So the business case, yes, it's a downturn. We can be naive, but it can also be an opportunity to show, well, if you don't act now, your business and your profit will be affected in the medium and long term because the environment, the complexity of the environment and international regulation are changing in a way that we all want business to become social enterprises in the future.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. Okay, so now we've heard a couple of things. What are social movements? What is the role of citizens and consumers? What can media do? What are the attitudes, the knowledge, attitudes, and practices of young people in Asia when it comes to responsible consumption, and how does that influence companies? And we have now discussed the business case. So now let us bring all of this together. So how do we leverage the power of citizens and consumers to push duty bearers? And let us talk also perhaps about the concept of social tipping points. So the other day I read an article in a newspaper that triggered my interest in this. So researchers whose work was published in Science, the academic journal, in 2018, they discovered that a critical threshold was passed when the size of a committed minority reached roughly 25% of the population. So that means that when 25% of the population became convinced that they needed to take action on something and actually started to take action. Now, at this point, this is what the researchers of the paper argue, that at this point, 25% of the people in a certain society, social conventions suddenly flip. And they found that between 72% and 100% of the people in the experiments started to change their opinions and behavior. And I quote, destroying apparently stable social norms. Now, I would like to ask all of you, actually, whether we can reach such a tipping point with business and human rights. But to answer that question, we first need to establish what defines us as a business and human rights movement. What is the transformative potential of our collective movement, and how can we reach a tipping point that turns citizens and consumers into key drivers for business and human rights? And I would like to start with Sumi, please.
Thanks, Kevin. And I'll go back to the question that I ended my first point with, which is, have we marginalized the role and agency of social movements? And if we go that, maybe that is our answer to creating tipping points. But to achieve that tipping point, we need for citizens to feel safe. We need for 25% of the global citizens to feel safe, to be able to raise their concerns and resist certain forms of business practices. And at the moment, we don't have that. In this region, we don't have that. Our civic space is shrinking. So how are even 25% of our citizens going to feel safe to raise concerns about the business practices when there is such a tight lock between businesses and governments? That's the critical challenge. And I think for me, it's the critical barrier to be able to reach that tipping point here, the shrinking civic space. However, maybe there are new forms of expressing resistance in this region, and we're seeing it. I mean, Shubha, you've worked with young people. There are new forms of social movements emerging. Question will be whether these social movements are resilient. There's an interesting piece of research that was done to say, whereas the great thing about these new social movements is that they tend to come up very quickly, they tend to have vast numbers, but the shadow side of them is that they also, what the Chinua Achebe say, things fall apart, the center cannot hold. These social movements tend to not have a center where things fall apart because they haven't had the ability to build the organizational space amongst them for leadership to emerge. So, that's the space that we still need to watch in terms of new ways of expressing resistance. I think the other barrier to achieving social tipping points may be that, we're facing future unknowable ecological and social disruptors. We don't know. We really don't know what some of the impacts of climate breakdown will be. I mean, we know in terms of what it's going to mean when we hit 2 degrees, but we really don't know the full swathe of impacts it will have. And it does then require us as social movements, as citizens and consumers, as agents or actors in these social movements, to be able to behave in agile, adaptive ways, and to keep that. And so that will be the second thing we'd need to do. We need to be able to take far more, we need to be able to build social movements that can work and thrive in conditions of uncertainty, because uncertainties are coming quick and fast, and we can't, our oxygen or energy can't be depleted where we hit something that we're not recognizing and we don't know how to go forward on. And the third thing I think that will enable us to reach these tipping points is to break that lock that's created by this model of growing infinitely. If we can set a new frame of our economy that's to a just and regenerative paradigm, what does it mean? Not to have a sustainable economy, because we know that doesn't work anymore. Sustainable is not enough. We need to regenerate, restore, replenish the earth and its people, because we've just extracted so much that we can't just maintain anymore. If we can reset towards this deep transition towards a just and regenerative economy, then maybe we have a chance.
Yeah, the way behavioral scientists look at it is slightly different. It's reciprocity and herd mentality and the social signaling. Human beings are social animals. We want to belong to a group and we want to belong to a purpose. The problem is we're more likely to come together if there's a theme than if it's against a powerful person. So that's why many people would always suggest, and especially women and others are advised, that if you're in a narrow lane and you are being attacked, instead of shouting that save me from this guy, shout fire, fire, fire. Then more people will turn, and then of course you can take care of the perpetrator. So I think one of the areas that we need to research more is that how do they come together? There's not much literature around it, okay? And it's very difficult to generalize 25%, 30%, 10%. Many of the movements, okay, whether it's Arab Spring or even the farmers' protest or anything, the universities in India, and I'm not passing a judgment on them, just looking at the movement, how do they create? It starts with few people talking about a theme. There's something which triggers more people to join in, and before you know, the media and the social media plays a very strong role. The problem is the momentum, as you're correctly saying. What baffles is the momentum and the purpose. There's a dilution of both. Many people are interviewed often by researchers on the day 4th or day 5th of the movement that do you remember the purpose why you're here? And that's where they will simply say the herd mentality that my friends and others asked me to be a part of this movement, so I'm here. But I'm still a little bit more away from the center or the core topic. By the time you reach a substantial chunk, there's further and further dilution of that information and this misinformation. Only information is then centered around the core team which started. And then things start falling apart and then chaos. So this is what we need to be careful about, that how do you manage the information? How do you manage the information disparity and the misinformation so that there's no dilution of either the purpose or this misinformation in terms of the momentum? Thank you.
I'd just add one more
Yeah,
point. I
yeah.
completely agree that momentum and purpose and not being vulnerable to dilution is a key point. But I will reiterate safety. And in
Yes.
this region, that is critical. If we do not feel safe going out on the streets and standing in front of a shell, then that is going to dissipate a movement very, very quickly.
Exactly. That was my starting point, that people are much more comfortable standing up for a theme. But the moment you ask them to stand up against a power, the power could be an organization, it could be an university, it could be a corporate, it could be a government, okay? Things become different. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so perhaps an intermezzo. Are there any questions from the floor at this stage? Okay, let me turn to the virtual participants in that case. So someone is asking 4 questions, so I'll pick some of these out. And it's about consumers, so I will first turn to Shubo. Okay, so what is your opinion on the divide between consumers being alert and not dependent on price of product to make a value judgment as compared to those who can't afford such costs and depend on sales? So the divide between consumers being alert and not dependent on price of product to make a value judgment as compared to those who can't afford such costs.
The perennial problem. So if the football becomes $20, do I care about the child labor behind it? Versus if it becomes $100 because of organized. There's no simple answer to it. But if you ask pricing strategists and economists, they do have an answer which is called cross-subsidizing or market-based, okay? So you do charge some footballs at $100, so subsidize for it. And it can never be an excuse, Kevin, that I will allow a society or an organization for pricing advantages to exploit somebody else. And very often, you will hear it from both consumers that, okay, I'll turn a blind eye because as long as it's given to me at a cheaper price because I can't afford it. And organizations are saying that I'm in this low-cost business and low-profit margins, so where do I have the capex to invest in this? At the end of the day, there is no gray line when it comes to human rights. It's either black or white. If you need to exploit resources, natural resources or labor to give a price advantage, it is illegitimate, if not illegal. So that's my personal view, that you cannot simply justify it by saying, I have a price advantage. You cannot.
Thank you. And now actually back to Stefania again. So we go back to the media. So you've also been working at TRF with different organizations, right? It's not just media. So besides the media, what do you think are some of the key stakeholders that can enable an ecosystem-level approach to ensure responsible business?
Thanks, Kevin. And it's interesting that this question comes after we talked about how can social movement be stronger. And one of the points that, Roy, you were making is getting together, because one person is weaker than a group. So in our work and in the way in which we relate to the different stakeholders, collaboration, it's at the core of it. And really, as an actor in this field, what our role is really to facilitate connection and really facilitate the collaboration among these different stakeholders. But stakeholders is quite a generic word, isn't it? And we use it a lot, probably too much sometimes. When we refer, and why I refer to stakeholders, I mean the private sector, the civil society, and of course the media. We covered the media just now, right? But among these three stakeholders, civil society is definitely one of the key actors for us, one actor that we engage with, and one actor that we engage with in order to unblock the collaboration with the other stakeholders. So the media, the private sector, and actually I left out one important actor, which is the legal actor, so the lawyers and those who provide legal advice. Why I say this? Because I don't want always to bring back the discussion to what we do, but this is very much the way in which we interact in the different contexts in which we operate with these different stakeholders. So we talked about the media just now, right? And now I'm saying, well, the civil society can unblock the role of the media as well. So there is a connection, there is a need for connection between civil society and the media, and we've looked before at solution journalism as a way in. But that's not just the only one. And the reason why we want media and civil society to come together more closely is because what we've observed is that there has been historically a kind of misunderstanding of what are the roles and the rule of engagement in this relationship. So we have civil society counting on the media, sometimes to work a little bit like as their comms department, right? So we tell you something and you just need to report it because this is what we do and this is what we want to see in the media. But if you remembered, what we just said is that the media needs to be independent, the information that comes across needs to be unbiased, etc., etc. So the role of the media in the relationship with the civil society still need to be independent. We've seen how through solution journalism we can still create a connection. But more than anything, what we do is bringing together civil society and the media through journalism training, and specifically what we call dual track. Again, another fancy word, but basically we try to train both civil society in how they communicate with the media, and the media in how to communicate with civil society and grasping the important information to break down those barriers. And by breaking down those barriers, we create, of course, collaboration, we identifying area for potential collaboration, and also we show immediately the benefit of it. What I mean by that. Just a couple of months ago, we had one of these interaction sessions between the media and journalists. And we were actually quite surprised that it happened so quickly. After a couple of weeks, a journalist contacted us to thank us that we put them in touch with the civil society. Why? Because the civil society organization engaged in a rescue operation of a girl being trafficked at the border of India. And because of that connection that we created, we facilitated, we really didn't create it, but we facilitated, the civil society invited the journalists to join that rescue operation. And as a result of it, the journalists actually came out with a story about it. And this connection allows the journalists to also follow up on that story. And then what we said before, going against sensationalism and creating a narrative that engaged the public in a different way. So this is one of the ways, right? So media and civil society. But let's look at the civil society itself and how we relate to them and what we think it's a good way forward also to keep on strengthening and contributing to empower them in the ecosystem. So as a Thomson Reuters Foundation, we have a program which is called Trust Law, and we basically provide pro bono legal support to civil society and social enterprises. This pro bono legal support really look at how we can support these actors when it comes to legal issues. We know the civil society are at risk of end up in legal cases, and with providing and support that help them identifying what is the legal structure under which they operate. We are able to support them and also to provide them with legal research that then they can use for advocacy and campaigning. So we were discussing consumer campaigning, etc. And this is something that we've looked at. So the campaigning, why is it so important? And we've engaged the discussion around campaigning in multi-stakeholders meeting. Because what the campaign does is not just providing an information and raising awareness. What it does is a call to action. And so when we look at the ecosystem, it's okay the international regulation, it's okay the national regulation, but how do we create that demand from the bottom to actually enable consumer campaignings and social movement to actually request accountability for those who need to implement responsible business practice. So this is, and just last point, because I cannot leave out the business, can I? So businesses, of course, are the main actor and important action in how to enable responsible business practices. And what we are doing, again, through civil society, is showing to businesses at the ecosystem that civil society actually have a lot of services, a lot of initiatives that could actually be made available to the private sector and businesses to actually make them advance on responsible business practice. Let me mention helplines, grievance mechanism, responsible recruitment practices, etc., etc., etc. See that these are things that, or actions or initiatives that civil society does. And if businesses, and this is what we're trying to do, embedding these practices developed by civil society into business practices, then it allows businesses to actually promote and advancing on responsible business. I've been waving. I've seen Kevin waving to me because I need to be short, but this is very much so. So the ecosystem, three stakeholders, legal is an important input into this, and this is how we civil society, and this is how we aim for the ecosystem to support an advancement in responsible business practices.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing all that together, because I was saying this because I really also want to ask this question to Sumi because it relates so well to what you said, right? So you say we need this ecosystem, and Sumi, you were saying, you were talking about civic space, yes? So I guess the ability of social movements and collective action to thrive comes when there's a robust civil society. And we've heard Stefania talk about how can we have this ecosystem where all these actors work together. But you said in Asia Pacific, civic space is shrinking drastically, or at least in some parts of Asia Pacific. So how do we respond to these barriers to enable citizens and consumers to take action?
Thanks, Kevin. And I think I talked about this earlier. So I will make one final short point in answer to that. And it's a question, actually. What if businesses related to us as citizens and not consumers? What if that was our paradigm? So what if businesses related to us as citizens and not consumers? How would that change things? And I really value the question that came before from the audience around the consumer haves and the consumer have-nots, because much of our discussion today has been premised on the consumer haves, not the consumer have-nots. And the consumer have-nots are the ones that require food, energy, housing, medicines. You have no choice there, and yet you are in a system. So what if we change how businesses related to us and related us as citizens and not consumers, and in their purpose, in their ownership, in their financing, in their networks, and their governance, this becomes the central tenet by which businesses organize themselves.
This is a follow-up on what Roy has said regarding the 20 and the 80. How are we going to close the gap of the 60? So now my question is, who will pay for the higher cost of the products that are produced by the responsible business people? Will you pass it again to the consumer at higher cost, or shall the state subsidize it? And then whose duty is it to monitor all of these products that comes into the market? I mean, you had this very good, interesting analogy of the price range. So what do you think?
Honestly speaking, there are no answers to it, but there are new business models, and that's where I think, as Sumi have been talking about, as many have been talking about, the pricing paradigm has to be relooked at too. Why do I say there are some innovations taking place? And there was this gentleman named Schumpeter who believed that incremental strategies don't lead to innovation. You need creative disruption. One of the things that I'll talk about is an expensive industry when nobody thought that kind of innovation can be done was cars. How can a car maker reinvent and absorb the costs? A classic question, okay? Will you pass it on, or there would be a role of the state where it will be tax subsidies or rebates, the usual. But at the end of the day, it's circular, isn't it? The government won't pay from its pocket. It will come from a tax.
Get it from the consumers.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah, it will come back to the consumer, okay?
Yes.
Yeah. What they did was that they analyzed and said, what are the unnecessary, and that's the power of reputational planning. They did something which is called bulk booking. So in a state, they invested heavily in the community development, and when people in that state wanted to buy cars. There were no intermediary sales costs or advertisement costs involved, because there were at least 50 people or 100, they went together, they said, this is our booking. Businesses have to be really innovative about it. But there's no way can I pass it on, because honestly speaking, if I pass it on, pure economics would say that demand, there would be an impact on demand the moment prices go up. There's no way that the government can subsidize it beyond a certain point. We have to constantly innovate. The innovation could be in the manufacturing. The innovation got to be in the way we do sales and marketing. The innovation got to be in the way we look at HR and financing, IT, and that's why one of the most critical aspects that, or at least my takeout from today, was that business and human rights is seen as a vertical or as a department in big organizations. Whereas if it becomes a culture, it's a much more horizontal. The marketing person has to be sensitized towards business and human rights, because only then can he or she or they can come up with innovative ways of doing it. The supply chain too. The HR, the finance, and there are solutions possible. As I was saying, that there are ways that where we can relook at the cost centers. And because one of the powers of social movements, or one of the powers of doing good, is that the reputational good can also lead to consumer traction. And the consumer traction then removes many of the intermediary costs that today organizations have to bear to get one consumer. So it does give you a competitive advantage, provided we look at really creative and what we call innovative ways of doing it. Thank you.
Just to add, normally in the costing structure of any product, the manufacturing cost is probably 20%. The rest are all branding, manufacturing, advertising, and distribution cost.
Exactly.
So if we can get rid of the media part, advertising, probably we can really lower the cost, and it's doable.
Yeah. And again, it brings to the short term versus the long term, isn't it? In the short term, it's easier for me to simply increase my reach, increase my advertising spends. Okay? Whereas all these things take time, and that's why I so agree with Sumi's point that in the long term, businesses have to look at the rising, and I'm honestly, with the rising costs, they do not have an option but to get inventive and innovative about it. There's no, and that's the point that I was talking when I was talking that all businesses will end up becoming social enterprises, because it's the ecosystem which will force them to do so. Thank you.
Okay, I'll take one more question from the floor before we close. Yeah, I see a hand there.
Thank you so much. So my name is Mackenzie, and I work at the Satsin Graduate Institute of Business of Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok. In recent years, we've shifted our ethos to sustainability through entrepreneurial mindset. And so when we onboard new MBA and EMBA students, we bring them through a purpose-driven skills and values module to imbue the purpose of using business as a vessel through which we can build a better, a smarter, more sustainable and just world. So I want to pose a question to Sumi and to Shubha as well. I know that we talked about social movements in the context of civil society, but have you studied social movements that exist within the context of young professional networks, within even corporate structures? Because we want to galvanize a community of advocates and of leaders that are willing to both stand up against what is wrong and join together in values-based action. So how do we create responsible citizens out of all, including future business leaders? Thank you.
Thank you. I love that question, and it's one of my next little bugbears. Absolutely. I think the professions are where we need to look next. And Stefania's organization, TRF, does that with lawyers. I think, each profession, the reason why I say this is because each profession has its own values and logics, which determines how that profession responds to a problem. Architects respond to a problem in a particular way because their discipline tells them that you have to look at it in this way, and understand the problem in this way and have the solutions. Lawyers look at it in a particular way. Teachers look at it in a particular, doctors look at it. And I don't think we've actually paid enough attention to being able to change the mental models of each profession so that their values and logics align to the outcomes that we want. So, kudos for doing that. I hope that more investment goes into that area.
Completely agree with you. The problem is, and I'll talk about my own country. There are incubation hubs, there are enough startups in India, unicorns coming up. Every day the media talks about it. The issue is that social enterprises, there's nothing wrong with starting with a dream. The problem is, in a country like India, there are at least 2 million to 10 million different sources, social enterprises. Most of them don't fail, but most of them don't scale. The problem is when you go out for the first seed capital or the Series A. It's very difficult to change the paradigm that Sumi was talking about initially, because the people who are going to invest in your organization to help you scale that impact, okay, they are very profit-centric. And the problem is that our obsession with hockey sticks, you understand, you're from a B school, that how it goes down and the potential growth that we show in terms of consumer base. It's very difficult to show the social impact of what I'm going to do. It's much easier to create fancy spreadsheets to say the number of consumers that I'm going to get and the potential profit that, and the potential unicorn that this will become in the future. I think this will change because when your batch becomes the next set of Series A investors in the coming days, they will walk into a room and ask us, we'll talk about the business later on. First, let's talk about the impact numbers. What is it that you are going to bring? And it is that tomorrow that we are waiting for. Because one day, I would be really proud if not me, but you are sitting here and talking about this. And that day will come soon. Thank you.
Hi, trying to keep it short. Just a quick reflection and also a question. I think when we talk about what consumers can do, and I think this is a problem in emerging markets, particularly in Asia, the reality is I think Sumi's referred to it in other forums as well. There's a very close relationship between the governments and corporate sector. And for example, I'm from Thailand. We have problems with monopolistic and oligopolistic companies. So when you tell consumers, buy the change you want, the choices are limited. You can't, right? That space is extremely limited. As for the media, Stefania, what I've realized, I work on clean air, right? And now you think, okay, we all breathe to remain alive. In discussions with the media, what the feedback I've gotten is, if it's a news that doesn't move the stock market, we're not interested in covering it, which is sad. And also, I agree with you, on opinions, there's always an issue because, specifically in Thailand, one thing they don't do very well is they don't give the profile of the person who wrote the opinion. Therefore, the reader doesn't know how independent that individual is. If you have that, we will be able to do it. I come from the finance field, and you're required to do that by law, to have to say who wrote this article, what is their background. So I guess I wanted to find out from your wealth of experience on the panel, how do you break that impasse? Because civil society space is shrinking and pushing for change is very limited coming from the consumer side. And there's very strong oligopolistic, monopolistic power coming from the corporate sector. So I'd be interested to hear what has worked elsewhere, because what I'm sharing is not something unique.
No, it's absolutely not something unique. So in the relationship and in the engagement that we had with journalists and with civil society let's narrow it down to the 4 countries where we work, right? So one is Thailand, Malaysia, India, and Colombia. It's exactly for this reason that we try to enter and provide support to journalists. What I've said to answer the first question, so there is a certain level of information, or information should aspire to certain principles, right? But the media ecosystem, do we want to call it a media ecosystem, does not respect always those elements. And actually, if we look at statistics around how the audience engages with the media, we've noticed that as a result of COVID, but not only, there has been a disengagement. And the way in which information is now built is to give a very quick, simple solution to everything. And the amount of attention that you get from the public is with thumbs up, is a very simplified way of communicating, which sometimes doesn't mean that the complexity is simplified, it's just one way in. So, I mean, your question is the question, isn't it? So how we're going to change this? And I would like to tell you A, B, C, D, and E. So this is the magic spell. But as I said, or I think I said before, there are no magic spells. So what we can do and what we're doing as a facilitator and as a mediator between civil society and journalists is very much trying to not necessarily look at how many thumbs up you will get, but how, because you are reporting just on the news. If you report, what happens if you report on a story? So if that information that you were saying before, like, comes framed into a story in which the public has been engaged, maybe the public wants to know how the story ends. So again, why the way to do it, and this is probably a call to action if we want to look at this way for the media, is moving away from just one single news, one single thumb up, and try to embed what that news is in a story, because the engagement from the public is what then will bring and push your newsrooms to actually say, I want to know more about it. So that won't happen tomorrow. So far, we've trained 100 journalists in just something more than a year, and there are so many more that needs to that we would like to engage with. But as and again, I know that I need to shorten, but just as a sum up, there is no magic spells, but again, the media is part of an ecosystem, and the collaboration and creating connection and try to bring in and to elevate and to strengthen the principle around which information is developed is the key. It doesn't happen tomorrow. We hope it will happen the day after tomorrow.
Thank you very much, Stefania, Sumi, and Shubo, for this very interesting session. Thank you to the audience for all the questions. I thank you all very much for your participation at the second day of the UN RBHR Forum. We'll be in touch with you as usual with an email to show you what is happening tomorrow. We have some interesting sessions lined up, so please join us. And thank you very much for all of your participation today. I wish you all the best.